Did you catch the Brazilian president's keynote speech today?
Evening, Anna-Marie. Yes, I did. I managed to catch that. I guess, bearing in mind he's only been in situ for about 3 weeks now, he was rather thrust into the limelight with the US president's absence from the World Economic Forum. I think the speech pretty much stuck to the straight and narrow. New Brazil very much being the theme. Yes. We're open for business, looking to improve some of the issues as far as the politics are concerned in Brazil, looking to opening up in a more broader mindset for business as well. I guess striking all the kind of notes you'd really expect.
Right. He even came across, I don't know if this was your impression, but even a little bit, say, softer than the more bombastic personality we've been seeing on TV and in the headlines.
Well, you've got to remember, I think this was a conversation, a speech that was directed towards global leaders, global CEOs. This wasn't necessarily the sort of driving razzmatazz that an election would dictate. You really need to drum up the enthusiasm. This was more of a softer touch, a more encouraging, supportive and, I guess, professional speech.
Yes, a bit of that Davos polish.
Yes.
That he underwent. Now, Pompeo also joined, as we mentioned earlier, via satellite, via video conference. What grabbed you about that?
Well, he was throwing quite a lot of tough questions to handle.
This is true.
In fairness, a lot of the geopolitical headwinds that 2018 saw were driven by the US, so I guess it wouldn't have been completely surprising. Striking encouraging notes without really giving away too much of exactly what's happening, talking about looking to make progress with China and the negotiations there. I think as far as our take on it is concerned, I could certainly see China willing to spend a bit more money in consumption and buying US goods. Whether they're going to make too much headway as far as intellectual property is concerned.
This is the big question.
That's maybe a bit more of a difficult ask, but it really would change the structure with which Chinese businesses have been running. That's a tougher ask for the Chinese. There is still quite a bit of time to go yet, but he was striking positive tones.
Well, in the absence of the entire US delegation, it was important that at least someone show up and represent, right?
True.
So earlier we mentioned Brazil. Let's talk quickly about emerging markets.
Yes.
Now that we've got you at the table, developing nation stocks are up.
Yes, there's a slightly more positive take on them at the beginning of this year. I think, in fairness, there's a more positive take at the beginning of this year anyway. The words we used, two words we used to describe last year in our sort of annual review of the year was fear and greed. Greed very much the beginning of 2018 and fear halfway through December. We were down about 17% on the S&P 500, really showing that there was a bit of panic out there. And part of that was driven by the US interest rate decisions and where they were going. So we've seen a decent bounce in equities since then. Emerging markets specifically, a lot of small and medium-sized businesses, their debt is in US dollars. So as the Fed had been raising interest rates, the cost of borrowing money and therefore business and their ability to expand operations was being constrained. I think with the change in the Fed's direction, that has seen an ease up in fears and worries about how these emerging markets might perform. So I think there's a touch more optimism as far as emerging markets are concerned, and that's playing a large part of it.
Not to dampen the mood, but the IMF, as we know, also put out, they did another revision, let's just say second in 3 months, revised the global economy down. They are quite pessimistic.
Yes, they've downgraded from 3.7 to 3.5%.
0.2%. How important is that?
Well, it's worth noting, all right. It is, to a certain extent, the IMF are regarded as being the positive mindset and helping others to follow. And again, as we touched on just before we came on air, the chicken and the egg kind of question, which is it in regards to confidence and then markets following suit? And it does help to bring that around. It's no real surprise. We've got a lot of headwinds that were hanging over the markets last year. They haven't really been resolved. China and the US, for instance, the situation with Brexit. There's a number of questions that still hang over the markets. As much as we might have edged towards some sort of resolution in many of these things, we haven't had them completely resolved.
And just to come back to Davos for a moment, I mean, business leaders in Davos are concerned. I mean, PwC put out their annual CEO survey, and again, pessimism reigns.
Yes, I think it was worth noting that short and medium-term growth expectations had sort of fallen from mid-40s to mid-30s. And when we drilled down some of the PwC figures, I think there's been a rebalancing of where the CEOs are seeing their growth potentials away from the US. Has seemed to be quite a bit. Certainly Chinese companies have moved quite aggressively away from the US.
Right.
It's also worth noting as well that when it comes to revenue growth next year, 80% of CEOs were stating that they felt cost-cutting operations were actually going to be what were driving their revenue growth rather than expansion or increased sales.